So there's a lot in education at the moment being talked about regarding behaviour and how behaviour is worse post-COVID than it's ever been. And I think there's some truth in that, and I think it's not as simple as people would like it to be. I think there's a lot of factors there which I'm going to talk about. But I want to do that through the means of the social discipline window, which is something from Paul McCold and Ted Watchell, which is then sort of brought to my attention by the work of Mark Finnis and his restorative practice work that he's done. And the model of the social discipline window is expectations down one side and levels of support down the other. Now, there'll be some young people, certainly after COVID, that have had different experiences, and some of the experiences that they will have had during that time, being at home for certain periods of time, maybe it wasn't even during COVID, maybe it was beforehand, but they've been at home and they've been in a position where they've not really been interacted with as much. They've been spending a lot of time on their own, they've been occupied with technology, and there's been no real expectations placed upon them. They've been looked after and fed and watered, but never really heard the word no. And those young people are in what we know as a not box. And we don't want our young people to be there. We certainly don't want them to be there when they're in education, which again is something that some of those young people will experience. They'll have been not pushed too hard, but also not really supported in those education settings. But where a lot of our young people find themselves is over here. And over here, they're in a position where we've got young people who, possibly because of some of those experiences that they've had, are now struggling. And they're struggling when they go into a classroom and they're overwhelmed by what's going on around them. They're overwhelmed by the other young people. They're overwhelmed by the work that they can do. And so in our attempts to support that young person as best we possibly can, we try to insulate from those stresses. And by insulating from those stresses, we protect that young person and we stop them becoming distressed in our school settings. And it may well be that that's where we need to start with our young people. It makes a lot of sense, but we don't want to stay there, because if we are taking all of those stresses away from the young person, how do we teach them to manage stress in the future? So protecting them is one thing, but we've actually, if we're going to help the young person, we've got to teach them to be able to manage that stress for themselves. So we don't want them down here in the 4 box for any period of time. Now that's where, again, a lot of primary settings are having to start, and I fully support that. It's where specialist settings might well start. But what those settings are very, very good at doing is gradually exposing those young people to those stressful situations and giving them a ladder up into the with box. And the with box is really important, and we now bring in those high expectations alongside those high levels of support for those young people, and we can control their exposure to those stresses. We can pick them up when they fall, and we can help that young person to learn from their mistakes and teach them behaviour, which is exactly what we need to be doing with our young people. Now, secondary schools have always existed in the 2 box, and it's very hard for them to be anything else, because the sheer numbers of young people in secondary schools means it's always going to be hard to provide the levels of support that they had in primary schools. If you've got 1,000 plus young people and you're a teacher who's seeing 100 plus children a week, it's much harder. The expectations are naturally going to be higher. Expectations of things like executive functioning, organisation, remembering equipment, organisation of timelines and thoughts, and all of those different things, and there's more structure to everything around them. So some of those young people, especially young people with undeveloped frontal cortex who have executive function difficulties, are going to find secondary schools more difficult naturally. And there's always been that kind of acceptance within education that probably 5% of children would probably struggle, and they'd be in this no man's land between 2 and with, where they need a bit of extra support to pull them over into the with box. And then what would happen is we'd have pastoral staff who would come in and support those young people and throw them a life raft that's going to give them a chance to get over into that with box and provide the levels of support needed for that 5% to be successful in mainstream secondary schools. Now, the problems that we've got at the moment are twofold. One is that 5% pre-COVID is now 10, 15, 20%, and we don't have enough pastoral staff and enough life rafts. And the other problem that we have is that, and there's a lot of concern this week about, you know, a new head of Ofsted who's going to be really, if he's true to form, will be very, very rigid on those expectations, and rather than providing support, a big history of exclusions, which means we're even more in the two box than before. The no man's land just got bigger and has room for a lot more young people. Now that potentially is going to lead to a fork in the road, if you like, when it comes to those situations. We've got two choices. We can either become even higher with the expectations, as a lot of the zero tolerance schools have taken that approach, but we all know how many children are currently out of education. The other option is that we make behaviour everybody's responsibility. We prioritise curiosity, safety and understanding of behaviours and make everybody part of the pastoral team. We put more focus on the holistic, nurturing, supportive side of education, and we move the line the other way and make the with box bigger. Now, that's what the schools that I'm working with are doing their very best to do, and that's what the schools where we are changing the perceptions of why the children are struggling in terms of their behaviour, especially post-COVID, are doing. So hopefully this has been of help to people in understanding the current climate.